everyone. Welcome to the third session of Class Struggle Revisited, Theory, Method, and Praxis, organized by Shahrazad Mojab, Shireen Hagu, Genevieve Ritchie, and Wissal Abu Kadum. Before we begin, I would like to acknowledge that this conversation is taking place as part of a University of Toronto event, and the university for thousands of years has been on the traditional lands of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and most recently the Mississaugas of the Credit River. Today, this meeting place is still home to many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island, many of whom continue to fight against colonization, extractive industries, carceral states, and gendered sexual oppression. To understand contemporary class structure and struggle, we must begin by acknowledging the historical colonial violence and exploitation that has resulted in conquest and expropriation of Indigenous lands. My name is Chandni Desai, Assistant Professor in the Critical Studies of Equity and Solidarity at the University of Toronto, and I'm going to be facilitating this afternoon's session. Today's session focuses on two key books, David Austin's Fear of a Black Planet and Robin D.G. Kelley's Freedom Dreams, The Black Radical Imagination. I'm particularly delighted to be facilitating this session because Freedom Dreams is one of those texts that has had one of the most significant intellectual and political influences on my own research on Palestine, teaching and organizing. A book I've read 12 years ago, which continues to excite me every time I reread it, a book I can never put down, and a book that has relevance for the politics of today. I'm so thrilled to welcome our guests, Kali Akuno and my dear friend and colleague, Beverly Bain. Kali joins us from the US. He is the co-founder and co-director of Cooperation Jackman. He served as director in the mayoral administration in Mississippi and also served as the co-director of the US Human Rights Network and the People's Hurricane Relief Fund based in New Orleans after Hurricane Katrina. He was also the co-founder of the School of Social Justice and Community Development in Oakland, California. Beverly is a Black queer feminist, anti-racist, anti-capitalist scholar and professor that teaches in women and gender studies in the Department of Historical Studies at the University of Toronto. Beverly has devoted 40 years of her life to activism, particularly around anti-racism and specifically police violence, feminism, anti-capitalism, and LGBTQ issues. Our esteemed speakers will be reflecting upon praxis of the Black radical tradition. Our session today is slightly different from the previous one because our guests will be speaking about their own life and experiences in relation to questions I've developed on the key ideas that emerge from the text that we've read. And so before we begin our conversation with Kali and Beverly, I want to take us back first to the books we've read just to re-jog everyone's memory depending on when you read the books, and also highlight some key areas in the text as the group engages in close reading. In Freedom Dreams, Robin D.G. Kelley writes a collective history of the Black radical imagination. His attempt at writing the history of Black radical movements was inspired by key questions about what Black radicals dreamed about, what they thought about, what influenced them, how they articulated a new world, and what moved them to struggle in the first place. Kelley grew up in a working class neighborhood in Harlem. His political coming of age was shaped by his environment, engagements with the works of Marx, Lenin, Mao, Fanon, Césaire, Cabral, C.L.R. James, and others, his observations of the Black Panther Party and other radical movements that were active during the 60s, all of which shaped his class consciousness, his political organizing as a communist, and his intellectual life. This book chronicles that journey, but it is not a memoir. Freedom Dreams is premised on the argument that the catalyst for all political engagement is not oppression or misery, but it's hope, in which people work and promise to construct a new world from that which was already inherited. Freedom Dreams is a work of historical recovery and interpretation that explores the radical utopian dreams of Black movements, intellectual artists, and activists. By examining socialism, the Back to Africa movements, Third World liberation, Black radical feminism, reparations, and surrealism, Kelley argues that renegade Black intellectuals, artists, and activists created a vision that was more often inclusive to their American counterparts as they thought about the relations of race, class, gender, and sexuality as co-constitutive, and in doing so, they pushed the boundaries and insights of Western radicalism. Freedom Dreams is of particular significance because it traces the circulation of Marxism and Black radical thought across time and space, from the works of Lucy Parsons to Ida B. Wells, to Du Bois, Malcolm X, Garvey, Paul Robeson, Richard Wright, Claudia Jones, Aslanda Robeson, Amiri Baraka, Barbara Smith, Angela Davis, the Black Surrealists, and so many more. He shows us how their ideas challenged and reshaped communism, surrealism, feminism, and pushed these movements into new directions, centering the question of liberation from all forms of oppression and exploitation. Kelly's discussion of Black radical feminism is one of the most significant contributions of this book, particularly his discussion of the Combahee River Collective and how the collective developed a multi-dimensional analysis, refusing to rank oppressions based on race, class, and gender in a differentiated, abstract way, which their ideas drew from earlier Black Marxist and Black nationalist movements that were anti-racist and anti-capitalist. Kelly grapples with and exposes the way in which radical praxis has often been suppressed and policed. He writes, not only by our enemies, but by leaders of social movements themselves. The utopian visions of male nationalists or so-called socialists often depend on the suppression of women, youth, gays, lesbians, and people of color. By situating the work of the Combahee River Collective and Black radical feminists, he writes against the disavowal and absence of Black women from radical movements. On page 149, he writes, I quote, "As socialists, the collective did not believe that a non-racist, non-sexist society could be created under capitalism, but at the same time, they believed, the Combahee River Collective, that socialism was not enough to dismantle the structures of racial, gendered, and sexual domination. The core of their vision was manifest in their political practice. Combahee members immediately saw connections between race, class, and gender issues by working in support also of third world women. The collective insisted that Black and third world women's position at the bottom of the race, gender, class hierarchy put them in a unique position to see the scope of oppression and dream a new society. We might use our position at the bottom, they asserted, to make clear leap into revolutionary action. If Black women were free, it would mean that everyone else would have to be free, since our freedom would necessitate the destruction of all systems of oppression," end quote. We see the legacy of Combahee 40 years later being articulated by today's progressive racial justice and feminist movements, and essential to their praxis. Most importantly, Kelly reminds us that radical Black feminists redefined the source of theory. Another significant contribution is that Kelly charts how these Black radicals, particularly in the 60s and 70s, connected with other political struggles and movements from China, Cuba, Vietnam, Angola, Algeria, placing emphasis on internationalism, specifically anti-imperialist internationalism, which he beautifully captures in chapter 3, Roaring from the East, Third World Dreaming. This helps me segue to David Austin's fear of a Black planet. The Black radical tradition also informs Austin's inquiry on the emergence and existence of Black radicalism in Canada, particularly in Montreal. Austin tells the story of the giants of Black radicalism that descended on Montreal to discuss the history and struggle of people of African descent and the meaning of Black power during an era of widespread racism in the West and colonialism and imperialism in the Third World. Austin chronicles and details one of the most important gatherings of radical intellectuals in the 20th century and the speeches that were delivered by C.L.R. James, Walter Rodney, Stokely Carmichael, Robert Hill, Richard Moore, James Forman, a generation of revolutionaries that envisioned liberation that was rooted in socialism, self-determination, jazz, and soul. The gendered question also comes up in Austin's book on page 84, when he writes, I quote, "The absence of Black women in general who actively participated in social movements have deprived us of much needed insight into the inner workings of gender in Canadian-based Caribbean and Black 60s political groups. into how these relationships shape the political of the groups in question and how gender relations within these groups inform our understanding of the dynamics of liberation, end quote. Austin also speaks to the racialization of Anglophone Black people in Montreal during the 60s and their praxis and resistance, specifically documenting the forgotten Sir George Williams affair, the largest student occupation in Canadian history. Austin provides readers with a primer on the history of slavery in Canada, which has also been disavowed and hidden from the Canadian settler states nationalist narratives, and he therefore links the racism that Black people systemically endure in the present to slavery. He writes, I quote, "Slaves, most of them lived in Quebec City and Montreal, were never more than a tiny minority of the population, but size is one thing and the social significance is another." Using Saidiya Hartman's concept of the afterlife, he writes, "The concept of the afterlife permits us then to recognize how the past influences the present, profoundly and negatively, shaping the lives of Blacks in the diaspora and in Africa. I think it helps us understand state violence, policing, incarceration, unemployment, poverty, and the killing of Black, Brown, and Indigenous life in the present. Our esteemed speakers are part of this radical tradition. They themselves, I consider, Black radicals who have resisted and challenged forms of state violence, oppression, and exploitation in the afterlife of slavery. And their work has given collectives, including some of us, hope to imagine another world like the renegades that Robin Kelly talks about. Thank you, Beverly and Kali, for being with us. It is such a pleasure that you've joined us, and we can't wait to have the conversation. So the first question for both of you: how has the Black radical tradition shaped your own consciousness? What ideas, intellectuals, cultural figures, political figures, movements have shaped your journey? And if you can speak to that, whether it's the past or in the present. Kali, do you want to begin? And then Beverly, do you want to follow by
that? Sure. First off, thank you all for having me. Second, I appreciate this group forming and discussing and raising these particular issues. There's not enough of this particular focus in the U.S. right now, I think. So I'm happy to see that. Now, what shapes me? I would be remiss in not pointing to an indirect Canadian connection to my own political development and trajectory. I have a relative, an uncle, who lives in Toronto, Canada, who's been, he came there resisting the Vietnam War, and lived a good portion of his life in the underground there, but also a part of the revolutionary movements, the Black Liberation Movement there. And it was through a lot of his writings, because he worked as a journalist, works as a journalist in the present tense, let me be clear about that, works as a journalist. And, he would send, he rarely, if ever, could come to Los Angeles, where I grew up, and where he was born. Well, he was actually born in Louisiana, but where he was raised. My mom would make sure that all of these packages that he sent of his writings and clippings of things that he was involved in when I was a kid growing up in the 70s and 80s, that me and my brothers, picked these materials up and read them. We would discuss them at the dinner table, or whenever we could. And they ranged from everything from, what was going on in Grenada and what was going on in Angola, Ethiopia, what was happening in Zania, better known to many as South Africa in the 70s and 80s. And, being in kind of weekly correspondence with him was one of the many, not just the only one, but one of the many, but the most kind of enduring things that really shaped a lot of my own political consciousness and moved me in a direction towards Marxism and socialism and communism, very explicitly and directly. It was also influences growing up in LA in the 80s from via the punk scene and the rap scene, also a heavy anarchist influence, which hopefully one day I'll get a chance to write about, because that particular history seems to be lost or not being talked about as much. But my uncle was also part of really a family line of activists and radicals. We had members in the family tree who were, part of the Communist Party, part of the Nation of Islam, part of the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters, part of the Deacons for Self-Defense and Justice. So these things, kind of run, thankfully, in our family. And I'm not saying everybody in the family was a full-on radical. Please don't get that misperception. My family had, like most Black families in the U.S., the broad range of your hardcore kind of Christian fanatics, often a right-wing bent, to the folks like my uncle. So we had the full range of everything, and all those different things, had a profound impact on my worldview and my upbringing. The last thing I'll really say that both of my parents were in the movement, radical organizations. They were both born and raised in Los Angeles, California. They were the first of the generation in our families, both sides of the families, who were born in Los Angeles. Remember, our folks were coming primarily from what is now known as the Deep South, and either in the United States or on one side of the family, also from Latin America, from Mexico explicitly. It was what really turned me into, I would say, the political creature that I am, even with all of that upbringing, was some of my own direct experiences. And one of the ones that was probably the most telling for me was the Summer Olympics of 1984 in Los Angeles. There, many of the things in particular that my father would always tell me about the role of the United States government in U.S. imperialism and its destabilizing force on throughout the globe really came to bear when, in the midst of those Olympic Games, the LAPD and the Sheriff's Department basically cleared the streets for about 2 months of all of the kind of the underground economy, particularly the drug trade, that they couldn't, they didn't want out on the streets, or they didn't want control. And what that taught me very clearly was, number one, the power of the state. B, its knowledge and understanding of kind of the underground economy, who the players were, what the supply chains were. And that C was very critical, that the carnage that I was growing up with in Los Angeles was something that was being mediated and something that was being, to an extent, orchestrated by greater forces of capital in the state. And they were allowing this to happen because of what they demonstrated by locking everybody up and just making the streets more out, that they knew and they could have stopped it almost at any point in time if they so chose to. And that was what really brought a lot of, the things that my parents were saying, that sometimes, I was born and raised in the United States, so I'm just as subject to the propaganda as everybody else. So sometimes I grew up thinking that my parents were exaggerating a bit about, how this thing functioned, how it operated, how it worked. And that summer really taught me, no, they were spot on. And this is something, for me, it was just seeing how my family members were treated. I'm not saying something that was abstract, front and personal, how many people were arrested and detained, not held on no charges and things like of that nature. It just made it personal to me, and it really got me to really not just use the education as kind of a backdrop of knowledge that I had, but to go much deeper and to really explore the connections and what my particular role was in the world and how I was connected to everybody, all working class people all over the planet in one way or another, and to figure out how to be in active solidarity. That summer of 1984 was the critical pivotal moment in my life that made me, I would say, the foundation stone of the kind of the activist that I've been trying to be all of my adult life.
Thank you, Beverly. For you, how has this tradition and what are the people or the ideas that have really influenced your work?
First, I want to talk about the Black radical tradition, which was the work of Cedric Robinson, first and foremost. But it was his theorization, his written work. But the practice, which is about resistance itself and Black resistance, that actually was very much centered on challenging, culturally, politically, socially, all of the after effects of slavery, which includes such things as migration, immigration, separation, fragmentation, all of those things of Black communities forced, migrations and eruptions of Black lives following slavery. So the Black radical tradition itself, I would argue, has always been embedded in us, right? It has played out in so many ways at so many junctures historically, in our lives. And I think it's really critical to point out, that the Black radical tradition itself was very much led by Black women at various points. And often we talk about the Black radical tradition and we speak about all of the Black radical men, and that's fine. However, what we don't often speak about is that a lot of the actual shifting and creativity in terms of opening spaces, in terms of, directing various ways for transformation has been conducted by women at different points historically. So for instance, one of the things I know that actually really stayed with me and I think was my awakening as a Black radical queer feminist was the Black Power movement in 1970 in Trinidad. And that followed actually 1969 uprising at Sir George Williams University that was led by Caribbean students who protested the fact that a professor they had reported, a science professor who continued to deny many of them, passing grades or proper grades so that they can succeed, was actually, the administration ignored the plea. And as you know, according to Austin in his book, he described what followed was the takeover of the university, Sir George Williams, by these students. And it ended in a fire in the computer room, and many were arrested and deported. However, that actually created enormous, uproars and uprisings across the Caribbean, Trinidad in particular, and Jamaica and Barbados at those particular times. In Trinidad, I remember in 1970, that's when I actually recognized that there was something happening. There were women and men out on the street. In particular, a lot of women were at the forefront, occupying the parks, occupying Woodford Square, which was known at that time in Trinidad. And many were arrested. And that, the inspiration came from what was happening at Sir George Williams University. And that actually spurred me on. And then in 1973, there was another shift in the Black Power movement. And this was led by students from the University of the West Indies And one of them, her name was Beverly Jones. And when we trace Beverly Jones' sister is in England now, and there is actually the whole, there's actually, and Beverly Jones' sister was connected to the mangrove movement in Britain, where the mangrove, that became known as the mangrove, so it became the mangrove movement, where the restaurant named the Mangrove and a number of Blacks were arrested, and it became, and there was an uprising. It's now a movie, it's now a film that was actually being produced. But the point I'm trying to make is that how this movement was also very global, and how a number of women, Claudia Jones, for instance, a Black communist from Trinidad who moved to the US and then was deported from the US to Britain, and who was a well-known communist, right? Black communist, Black activist who wrote the West Indian Gazette. I actually used to get that through my father because he traveled. And these were the things that inspired me when I was growing up in Trinidad. So when I came to Canada to go to university, the first thing I looked for was for politics and activism. Yes, I wanted to find where Black people were, because I wanted to find, political Black activists out in the diaspora, and the work that they were doing out here. And what I encountered immediately as I arrived, I remember I came out of the subway, the Bathurst subway, and leaflets were being given out by a number of Black women, Black feminists, who I came to know later on. And these women, what had happened was that a Black man was shot by police, and there was a big uproar at the time, and they were giving out all kinds of leaflets to encourage people to come, to encourage people to protest, to meet down at Christie Pitts, right? To protest this the shooting of the police. And I immediately grabbed a leaflet, and that's when I started becoming really connected to what was going on in Toronto. And I encountered people like Makeda Silvera. I encountered people like Sharona Hall. In fact, she was one of the first people I met who was giving out leaflets. And I encountered, later on, people like Dion Brand, and a number of these women who were actually at the forefront of these struggles, right? And who were actually really radical, whose position was one that clearly indicated one that was revolutionary. That was one that was about revolution and about liberation and about shifts and change in a fundamental way, and also understood the dynamic of gender and the way that women were decentered in the narratives and rhetorics and organizing around struggle here in Canada, around racism, around issues around women and men's lives in the context of underemployment, in terms of immigration issues, in terms of violence and state violence. Even though men played much more of a visible role through, leadership, women were actually the ones who were centered, like really at the forefront in terms of taking the risk, also to ensure that the message got out, that they were fearless in terms of calling out the state, right? And calling out the violators and the aggressors, right? They were fearless in those encounters. And also in terms of the fact that these were women who were also queer, right? I mean, we didn't use the term queer then, but they were also women who, were also clear in terms or understood relationships among women and understood the importance and significance of those kinds of relationships and how those relationships shaped and supported, the Black community here and the communities here in Canada, right? And how those kinds of relationships also made room for relationships, for other kinds of relationships, right? So those were some critical foundations for me in terms of my coming into the politics here in this country. And then I joined the Communist Party. And that was a point of conflict, which we can get to at certain points, in the sense that while the Communist Party shaped my politics in terms of understanding class and materialism and Marx, right? It also, I also grappled and struggled with the party on questions of race and gender, on questions of sexuality, in terms of questions of understanding intersectionality. Understanding, again, this is where I think people like, Cedric Robinson and the Black radical tradition made sense, because then we get to think through and talk about, how we understood, class, right? And how was class politics actually developed within Marx? And class politics was developed within Marx, according to Cedric, and I agree with him that it was really, the assumption was that, there was a clear break from capitalism and feudalism. And, Cedric Robinson's argument was that was not the case, that, that feudalism, actually, there was not a real break. Class was all, so there was an already embedded racism within capitalism, right? But that was not reduced to class, right? There was something significant about the way that race and racial capitalism shaped the labor of Black, brown, and other racialized bodies, such as indentureships and slavery, right? And genocide, creating what, Mbembe calls, necropolitism, right? That certain groups, through racialized labor and violence, will produce, for disposability, right? They will produce for death and for disposability, right? So I think there was something very profound about Cedric Robinson's understanding of racial capitalism, and understanding and shifting from that notion that class was somehow devoid of race or devoid of anything else, or devoid of gender. And in that case, we got this kind of reductionist idea about class politics. And I thought that was very important for me in my learning, which also led to my understanding of why I couldn't continue to be a member of the Communist Party. But I'll stop there so we can continue. Yes.
Thank you. That is incredibly helpful to have that history. And what I just want to highlight before I move to the second question is actually Cedric Robinson was Robin Kelly's teacher, and so Freedom Dreams also comes out of Black Marxism and other works of Robinson's that really does this work around showing the relationship of class in terms of Black struggle. So I want to move to thinking about, what has come up in both of your answers is the way ideas and politics reverberated globally. And internationalism was central to the Black radical tradition, particularly in the way in which, in the context that we're in right now, North America, the US and Canada, Black people in North America made sense of their place in these nation states as an internal colony, linking, their struggle for liberation with international struggles against colonialism in the third world and imperialism. And so I'm just wondering, in your own political organizing, how does the principle of internationalism, how does that come in, and how does that inform your commitments around solidarity? Kali, would you like to begin?
Good question. Well, I mean, I'm going to say this just in the context of some current struggles, but also some historic struggles. There have always been a certain kind of recurrence of reactionary politics, even within the Black communities spread throughout the diaspora. And right now we are really confronted with a growing phenomena kind of embedded in this organization, and it's somewhat of a movement called ADOS, American Descendants of Slaves, which takes a very anti-Pan-African position and orientation that we need to be, I think, somewhat mindful of, because there's certain aspects of their, at least rhetoric and posture, which is somewhat positioned, at least in arguments and claims from the Black radical tradition. Like one of the central things that they're pushing for is reparations, but reparations in a very limited context. They're just arguing for reparations of those in the United States who, I guess, whose ancestors have been in the 13 colonies in the areas that they subsequently colonized, from 1619 on. So a very English Anglophobe orientation, which completely kind of obliterates the incorporation of the U.S. empire of Spanish and French speaking territories and enslaved African people who were within them, and also free African people who were in them, particularly in some of the Spanish colonies in Florida, what would now be Florida and parts of Louisiana. And I'm saying that because there is a growing, corresponding with that, there's kind of a growing tendency to downplay internationalism that I think we need to be really concerned with. I know I've been deeply concerned with it, and some expressions of how it's kind of playing itself out in some articulations of the movement for Black Lives, which are very much kind of, if not antithetical to a broader internationalist position or Pan-African position, just not mindful of it. And I think it's really a result of some of the weakening of our movements the last 40 years, but the last 20 in particular. But also how we ourselves have been shaped by the cultural project of neoliberalism and neocolonialism, but neoliberalism in particular, of shaping and fashioning and viewing the struggle first and foremost as an individual endeavor rather than a collective one. And this is something I think we need to counter by highlighting, both within the tradition and in our practice now, the deep interconnections that exist. And I think we have to do that in part by raising what Beverly raised about materialism, because there's so many things that are now shaped and argue for somewhat absence of a material or materialist basis, but much more a subjective basis, which is not to say that our own personal reflections and experiences and perceptions aren't valid, but how they are shared and mediated in collective space requires, I think, some common agreements, which come back to a point of certain points around materialism that I would argue, and that's a whole another conversation, but one I think that's critical for developing a broader internationalist politics. Because without that, if we look at things on a kind of a global scale, you wind up looking at Trump as kind of an isolated phenomenon and not part of a deep systemic foundation to settler colonialism and white supremacy and patriarchy, deeply embedded in these North American projects, in the overall European, domination of the world the past 500 plus years, which corresponds with the spread of capitalism and imperialism, throughout the globe. And so without that, we don't have a clear understanding of, why a Bolsonaro emerges, why an Erdogan is playing the role that he's playing, why Duterte is playing the role he's playing, why there's a Modi in India, how these movements are connected, so you understand a Boris Yeltsin in the UK, or Urban in Hungary. And without that, we don't understand our collective power, right? And the power that you saw on display, I think, this past summer in particular, with things that started in Minneapolis, but then rapidly spread throughout the globe. And one of the things, some of the most, people may say it was symbolic, but I think it was very important on an international level that you started to see these edifices of slavery and colonialism that have been glorified all throughout the world being deliberately targeted in the UK, in Canada, in France, and parts of the Caribbean, in South America that I've seen in many other places, that are really continuing a deep work of decolonization, which didn't stop, as many people think, with the so-called national liberation movements that created another round of kind of nation states, but is really kind of extending that project further to dig and get at the many other kind of tentacles of the system that I think have been emerging really as correctives within our own tradition. And to that, I would cite, to bring back in how so much of today's movement for Black lives is really a product of the Cohambri River statement, in a sense that how much of that, that had been ignored by a lot of the radical movements in the US for about 20, 30 years outside of a small segment, but to see it grow to become the analysis of intersectionality, a particular analysis around women's liberation and gender liberation and sexual liberation, become a mainstream feature of the movement, I think reflects a deepening orientation within the Black radical tradition, but it has to be connected to the international dimensions of that, I think, for it to truly be powerful and for us to make the connections that we're going to need, I think, to get us to where we want to go.
Thank you. Beverly?
Yeah, first I want to say about internationalism, and if we go back to, let's say, the 70s, 80s, and 90s, internationalism was the kind of politics that progressives or left-wings, or particularly Black activists, and I'm positioning myself here in Canada because I think it's really critical for us to see the connection and to see the way that Blacks here in Canada practice a particular kind of international politics, particularly, and I'm particularly speaking in terms of left-wing Blacks and also Black feminists, radical, queer feminists practice a kind of that practice internationalism, in the sense of, if you look at the Black Women's Collective, a lot of their work made connections to women in South Africa, made connections to the US, made connections to Asia, made connections to indigenous struggles, right? There was a constant way of how the work always, because when we think of internationalism, we think of internationalism as crossing, of the work that we did as Black leftists and activists as crossing boundaries, as never necessarily, never, even though we were in the diaspora, we had migrated elsewhere, it was always about transcending those boundaries in terms of the kinds of struggles. We always understood that liberation meant, you know, that transcending boundaries. And for Blacks, we never believed, or we always understood that we didn't have a nation, or we didn't have, you know, we were nationless people. There are some of us, you know, during the time of the 60s and 70s that wanted to reconstitute a nation, right? And we saw that in the context of how Black nationalism played out, that Black nationalism began to homogenize Blackness, forgetting forgetting Blackness as, you know, as multiple and diasporic, and therefore, you know, one cannot think of a homogeneous identity that strictly connects us back to the continent of Africa, right? But that, you know, that this Blackness based on its, you know, location in various parts of the diaspora, right, also took on different kinds of, you know, ways in which Blackness got played out in those contexts, right? And the way in which Blackness, the kinds of, you know, historical experiences that as Black people we encountered in those kinds of contexts. So internationalism was something that we always understood as part of the liberation project. And I'm speaking about, you know, those of us who consider ourselves radical. I mean, there were so many of us here in Canada who were very connected to what happened in Grenada. Many who lived in Grenada during the time. There was always those of us who were connected to what was going on in Nicaragua. You know, there was always these connections of internationalism in terms of a political and left-wing project. In terms of what I think we're seeing today in terms of Black Lives Matter, and in terms of, I mean, I do think that there is a global Black movement happening. I do think that the movement is global. And I mean, if we look at what's happening in Brazil, if we look at what's happening in Britain, in France, there is a global struggle taking place. It is not, we don't see it as necessarily connected in the same way. Because movements don't function in the way that movements functioned prior to 1989, when, you know, when communism ended, right? For those of us who were communists and socialists, we understood movements as particularly organized in particular ways that one recognized leadership, one recognized particular kinds of political activism and political structures and systems and ways in which we actually practice politics, the way we narrated those politics, the way we conveyed those politics. There was something very clear in terms of a kind of foundation that does not exist in these political times, right? I mean, our world has changed, and very significantly. And Kali made those points in terms of what neoliberalism has done, what financialization, what has done in restructuring our world following 1989 and the fall of communism. That our world was absorbed within this very hyper-capitalized context globally. Therefore, movements have taken on a very different character, right? In terms of how we organize. And one of the things that has happened that I think that we have recognized that have happened in these organizing processes is that class has fallen out in these organizing processes. Right. I mean, that is one of the problems with the Black Lives Matter movement, is that it's become in some way, in some circles, in some circumstance, some context, a celebrity kind of performance, right? As opposed to one that is really insistent on fundamental structural change, one that is about liberation. So there are criticisms we can make about the movements in terms of as they exist, is that, how are we really, there has to be, we have to work towards something much more, confrontational, that is about, liberation that is about the end of the structure, the system as it exists, we have to work against capital, right? And I think that is the struggle that I am seeing in terms of even of the Black movement as well. It's globalized, there are uprisings, there are all of these momentary, but there's also a way in which we are willing to negotiate, shifts and changes. And in so doing, what happens is that we end up not really, really working towards restructuring and shifting and changing. We're not working towards revolution. We're not working towards liberation, right? We're working towards something that's more or less reformist in a way, in many contexts. And I think we need to be clear that cannot in any way, continue. And I do think that, when we take up people like Robin D.G. Kelly, we also have to think about the work that women are doing in terms of the way in which women's work, like Dion Brand, Nobisi Phillip, Christina Sharp, and many of these, Saidiya Hartman, and all of these feminist, Black feminist radical activists and scholars are saying that we also, we have to look at how we, change the narrative, how we shift the narrative. I mean, Dion's way of shifting the narrative is using poetry, right? How artists are shifting the narrative. How are we also, because one of the things that the Black radical tradition talks very strongly about, that it's also about creativity and culture, and also about, and how we put that to work, how we put that to work in the movement in terms of, simultaneously doing the work on the ground and working towards change. But as we do so, how are we imagining that? How are we using all of our creative and intellectual tools to do that as we do that, as we move forward? So I just wanted to.
Absolutely. I mean, yes, on all of those points. I think actually, speaking of revolution and reform, I want to segue actually to a quote from Freedom Dreams, in which, Kelly reminds us that the assaults from the present system at times necessitates that activists work for reforms, but those of us who are radicals, he says, understand that in some instances, it's possible to do so at the same time that we work for fundamental change that is revolutionary. And I think Angela Davis talks a lot about this when, we think about abolition and how at moments there are reformist agendas that have to get taken up because of the immediate needs of prisoners, for example. But then the goal is the abolition of the prison, right? Which is the revolutionary idea. So, in your, the work that both of you do, I'm just wondering, how do you think about reform and revolution? And do you see them as connected, or do you see them as broken, or do you see them as, in some instances, we need to be reformist towards the revolution, or are you just, no, we need the revolution only? And so, Kali, if you want to jump in on that.
If it was only so simple as we just leapfrog in the revolution, we would already be there. But it doesn't work that way. Despite is how much I would like to be there, it just doesn't work that way. I do think there is well, at least in the U.S. context, let me put it that way. I think there's an over-emphasis on this question in the absence of a question of strategy, right? And so that analogy, I think, is a helpful one, but what is often missing is, well, what is the strategy to get us to that point of abolition? And then what type of planning and what type of actions are needed on our collective behalves to get us there? And then how does our plans, because, every good plan runs into reality, and it's going to have to be adjusted, going to have to be adapted at some point. So what are your points of what you are willing to compromise? Say your principles. What am I willing to compromise? What am I willing to kind of adjust, and what has to stay the course? And it takes a lot of work for us to get on that same page. And I don't think that is something, I can tell you from our experience, it's not something to be discounted in any form or fashion. I think many of the projects that I've been a part of the last 10 years did a fair amount of planning, had even a fair amount of unity. But we didn't dig as deep on certain fundamental questions, particularly like how to resolve issues and differences. We didn't do that, so some of the deeper aspects of, I will place this within the kind of a politics of social reproduction, this issue of conflict mediation. Like we didn't do enough of that, and didn't necessarily have the tools to engage that within the framework of the tools that we had, which are both drawn from the Black radical tradition, but also drawn from the old Marxist-Leninist tradition, to be clear and explicit, that we just didn't have. And what that often leads to, without those, are a constant bending towards reform, and not a dig in deep orientation towards, what types of focus and disciplines do we need to get towards the broader vision of abolition, the broader vision of revolution. I know me and my work now, I've been trying to focus more on the long-term aspects and doing the kind of critical groundwork, if you would, to lay a material foundation for there to be an alternative, and the resources which don't depend upon foundations or don't depend on, generous liberals or, philanthropists or petty bourgeois forces, but that there is enough of a kind of a material foundation that working class, folks can pick up, utilize, and build upon to kind of change their own reality. That is what I would caution us to kind of really dig deep in on now. And it may seem counterproductive to say that, because one thing I'm gonna bring up now that I know it's probably all in the back of our mind, we haven't touched on explicitly yet, is the ecological crisis, which we're all confronting, and the active, extinction event that we are living through. There's no question about that is happening right now, and the dominant system that our species has created that's wreaking havoc upon the planet, which is capitalism, is definitely exasperating that at an unprecedented, unparalleled rate, like in all of geological time, as far as we know and have studied to this point. And I bring that up because it presents us with a very short window, a very short time frame in which to be able to act. But I'm coming to a deeper understanding that in order to kind of do something right, you kind of actually have to slow down and go deeper and go longer, and have those deep, hard conversations about, how we're going to mediate the different tensions and struggles that occur within our own movements, right? And to be able to wage the broader kind of class struggle effectively, knowing all of the twists and turns, all the different kind of material incentives, political incentives, let alone the repression, that the ruling class can basically throw our way and is throwing our way constantly. So how are we going to deal with that and not turn on each other, so that we can actually build the revolutionary subjects and transform to become the revolutionary subjects that we need. And I don't think, again, I'm just going to end and say, I don't think we should take that lightly. And we should not take the levels of socialization that we've all been involved in lightly, despite our, theory and schooling and learning. There's still a great deal of unlearning and unschooling that we have to do to build new kind of collective and social bonds that'll get us to a place where regeneration is a fundamental principle of what we're looking at instead of competition and things of that nature.
Thank you. Beverly, on that question of reform and revolution, and then we're going to open it up to Q&A. So if folks can get your questions ready, that would be great. And Beverly.
I think that we have to move beyond this whole idea of reforms. Reforms are not working. And I think what I've been, what seemed to be, and reform comes into place without us even wanting reforms, right? It's an automatic stopgap. So we don't have to work towards reform. We have to work towards liberation and revolution. And we also have to be clear that in working towards this struggle, that we have to be clear who's with us in this struggle. Because we're not going to be bringing everybody with us, because everybody's not going to be coming. Okay? When we talk about class struggle, we also have to understand that class also is very complicated in this context. We only have to watch what's happening in the US and seeing that working class white people are voting for Trump and have supported, white conservatism, white nationalism, and hate, right? Against Black people in general, and brown and other racialized people and poor people, right? Okay, so we know that when we talk about class struggle, and we talk about we must, which is why it is so significant and so important that we understand racialization and we understand race labor, and we understand gendered and intersections in this context and in this struggle, right? So that in deciding and in moving forward in terms of creating a liberation struggle. I think we have to be clear that this is going to take place in parts. We're not going to see something globally happen simultaneously and everybody going to rise up. This is going to have to start process and work within your context, right? Where you start making those movements happening in your context while making links internationally with other movements, right? Opening up those spaces. Like, you can't be talking about, liberating a liberation struggle without talking about Blacks in Brazil, or without, South Asians under Modi, in terms of, the context for, or elsewhere, or in Africa. You can't talk about that without, or you can't talk about it without talking about, the caste system in India. You can't, those conversations have to come together, because there's also about a kind of a raced population that's also significantly located. And you can't talk about a struggle here without talking about indigeneity and indigenous struggle, and you can't talk about it without talking about Palestine, right? So all of these things have to be connected in the conversation. So I guess my point is that what we are saying is that we're talking about an international revolutionary struggle that prioritizes the lives of those of us who are racialized and raced, okay? And those of us who are Black, and those of us who are indigenous. And I am very clear that for me is the priority, because we are under duress of white supremacy and whiteness, okay? And in order to move beyond that, we really have to start centering, the race and class and gendered struggle in this context.
Thank you, Beverly. Thank you both.